Imagine waking up in the 1930s, a decade often remembered through the Great Depression, unemployment, political tension, and the slow approach of another world war. But everyday life in the 1930s was more than one single crisis. It was a decade of families trying to survive on less, of men searching for work, of women stretching household budgets, of children growing up in homes shaped by money, class, discipline, and uncertainty. It was also a decade of radio, cinema, dance halls, buses, public housing, new consumer goods, and modern life continuing to move forward, even while confidence in the future was beginning to crack. The 1930s were not the same everywhere. A family in a struggling industrial town lived differently from a middle-class family in a growing suburb, or a farmer facing drought in the American plains, or a young person watching political extremism rise in Europe. But across the decade, one thing was clear. The promise of the 1920s had broken, and ordinary people had to live inside the consequences. The 1930s began under the shadow of the economic collapse that followed the Wall Street crash of 1929. The effects were not identical in every country, but the crisis spread through trade, banking, industry, wages, and employment. For many working-class families, the most frightening word of the decade was unemployment. A job was not just income, it was food, rent, reputation, stability, and dignity. When work disappeared, the whole household felt it. In Britain, older industrial areas were hit especially hard. Coal, shipbuilding, steel, textiles, and heavy industry all faced deep pressure. In the United States, the Great Depression devastated millions, while drought and dust storms in parts of the Great Plains created another layer of hardship for farming families. The 1930s were a decade where economic crisis was not an abstract idea. It lived in queues, rent books, pawn shops, empty factories, worn shoes, and anxious conversations at the table. Home life still depended heavily on class. For poorer families, the home could be cramped, cold, and filled with practical work. Cooking, cleaning, washing clothes, and caring for children remained constant. There was no modern convenience culture, no online shopping, no domestic abundance, no guarantee that wages, if they came at all, would stretch far enough. But the 1930s were not only a story of decline. In some areas, new housing estates, suburban development, cheaper consumer goods, and better transport changed everyday life for families who could access them. Some people moved into homes with more space, better sanitation, gardens, or electric lighting. For others, improvement remained out of reach. The same decade could offer a new radio in one home and unpaid bills in another. That contrast is one of the most important things to understand about the 1930s. Hardship was real, but it was not evenly shared. Work shaped identity as much as income. A person's job affected how they were seen by neighbors, family, employers, and themselves. For men especially, unemployment could carry a heavy social and emotional burden. But survival was rarely carried by one person alone. Women's unpaid labor inside the home became even more important when money was short. They stretched food, repaired clothing, and kept households functioning. Women also worked in shops, offices, domestic service, factories, nursing, and teaching, though opportunity and pay remained unequal. The idea that the 1930s were simply a time when men worked and women stayed home is too neat. Reality was more complicated. Many households depended on women's work, whether paid, unpaid, visible, or hidden. For working-class families, survival often meant doing whatever was necessary. Taking small jobs, sharing resources, making things last, and learning to live with less certainty than before. For children, the 1930s could be a decade of both routine and insecurity. Schooling was more established, but education still varied by class, region, and opportunity. Classrooms were formal, with an emphasis on discipline and manners. Many children expected to leave school much earlier than today. For poorer families, childhood could include responsibility from a young age, helping at home, running errands, and sometimes earning money. But childhood was not only hardship. Children played in streets, yards, and neighborhood spaces. They listened to radio programs, read comics, went to the cinema, and followed sports. The 1930s child lived in a world that was more modern than earlier generations, but still far more local, disciplined, and economically exposed than childhood is often imagined today. Women's lives in the 1930s were shaped by contradiction. Modern fashion, cinema stars, and magazines offered new images of womanhood. But social expectations remained strong. Marriage and motherhood still shaped how women were treated. In some places, women's paid work was criticized during periods of male unemployment. Even though many families needed it to survive, the home was still treated as women's responsibility, even when they also worked outside it. This made the pressure double: to earn if necessary, to manage the household, to appear respectable, and to keep children fed. The 1930s did not remove older gender expectations. It placed them inside a world where crisis made them harder to live up to. Technology and entertainment gave the decade another side. Radio became central to home life, bringing music, news, and drama into the living room. Cinema was one of the great escapes. By the 1930s, sound films had transformed the industry. For the price of a ticket, audiences could sit in the dark and enter a world that looked richer, brighter, and more dramatic than their own. Transport also continued to change. Cars were more visible, though still not affordable for everyone. Buses, trams, trains, bicycles, and walking remained essential parts of ordinary life. Television existed but was not yet normal. For most people, the media world was still radio, newspapers, magazines, and cinema. That was enough to change how people imagined the world and how the world imagined them. Health was improving in some ways, but it was still fragile. Antibiotics were not yet widely available. Serious infections, poor housing, and limited access to care still shaped ordinary life. Families feared illness deeply. A sickness could mean lost wages, lost work, debt, or worse. A sickness could mean lost wages, lost work, debt, or worse. Food depended heavily on income. Some families ate well enough, others stretched meals carefully, relying on cheap staples. The pressure of the 1930s was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet: a thinner meal, a postponed bill, a coat repaired again, a parent pretending not to worry. As the decade continued, politics became darker. The economic crisis weakened trust in old systems. In parts of Europe, extremist movements gained power by offering certainty, blame, and order. Democracy itself began to look less secure. In Britain, France, the United States, and elsewhere, people followed the news with growing unease. The rise of dictatorships and the failure of international agreements made the future feel more dangerous. By the late 1930s, the possibility of another war was no longer distant. In Britain, air raid precautions, gas masks, and public anxiety began to enter ordinary life. People who lived through the First World War feared for their children. That fear gave the end of the decade a particular weight. The 1930s had begun with economic crisis. They ended with the world preparing for war. Looking back, the 1930s can seem like a decade trapped between two disasters: the Great Depression at the beginning, the Second World War at the end. But everyday life was still full of ordinary human detail. People cooked, cleaned, worked, studied, queued, worried, listened to the radio, and raised children. The 1930s were a decade of making do, a decade where modern entertainment offered escape while economic life remained uncertain, a decade where public housing, radio, cinema, transport, and consumer goods made life feel more modern for some, while others were still trapped by poverty. A decade where public housing, radio, cinema, transport, and consumer goods made life feel more modern for some, while others were still trapped by poverty. It was a decade where ordinary people learned how fragile security could be. And by 1939, that lesson had become impossible to ignore.